Hello, ancient history fans. Welcome to Ancient History Bites with Eric. Today's episode 6 of my series on ancient history. So we're really making our way through ancient history. And today, for the first time, we're going to pop over to the Greek Isles to get some sun and eat some olives to discuss the two major Bronze Age civilizations in Europe, which were the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. We'll focus more on the Minoans as they were the first major civilization on the European continent, and then we'll tangentially discuss the Mycenaeans because they interacted quite heavily. So the ancient Minoans were what we called the people who inhabited the island of Crete, which is a very large island off the coast of Greece. So Minoan civilization sprang up around 1900 BC, so right during the time of the Middle Kingdom that we discussed in the last episode. And the civilization is what we call a palatial culture. So really their whole world revolved around these very large palaces that we can still see today. So they were economic, religious, spiritual, and cultural hubs for the Minoan civilization. So a lot went on there. And probably the most famous of these is the palace at Knossos, which we'll discuss at length later in this episode. And this palace, or these palaces in general, were very likely the inspiration for the ancient Greek myth of the Minotaur and Theseus who slays the Minotaur. So it tells this story of the mainland Greeks going over to Crete and Theseus eventually killing this Minotaur, which had been eating some of the inhabitants of the mainland. So it's very likely that a large part of that mythology was inspired by these ancient palaces. So that's pretty cool. So we'll discuss that quite a bit. And so unfortunately, the Minoans left us very little textual evidence of their existence because they didn't seem to write too much down. And even when they did, it's in a script called Linear A that we haven't really deciphered very well yet. So not a lot of textual remains, like stories, poems, books, none of that stuff. So we really have to rely on archaeology, so stuff that's in the ground and the buildings that remain to tell us about what this culture was like. And so, of course, scholars have had to make a lot of educated guesses about how people lived, what they thought, and what they did. But we still have fairly firm ground to stand on, and we still know a fair amount about this culture. So the ancient Minoans appeared to be a major trading power back in this early Bronze Age day, probably because of its location right in the middle of the Eastern Mediterranean. We find ancient Minoan goods all over the Near East, all the way to Mesopotamia. We even see some walls of a palace in Egypt decorated in the Minoan style, so that's pretty cool. So we'll talk about that later. And then we also find goods from other Near Eastern cultures on Crete as well. So there was a lot of trade going on, and the Minoans seem to be really at the center of it. So we've got a lot to discuss. I'm really excited for the episode today. So let's grab a glass of wine, do some bull leaping, and talk about ancient history. All right, so the Minoans. As I said in the intro, Minoan culture was really centered around these big, multi-level palaces built on the hills. So we have evidence for these palaces as early as 1900 BC. So pretty early in terms of European civilizations. Just to give some context, Greece wouldn't really flourish and flower into the classical age for over another 1,000 years. So this is a very early European civilization. One of the most famous of these palaces is the palace at Knossos, which you can see here. This is probably one of the best preserved, one of the largest. And so we're going to discuss it, at length. But it's worth keeping in mind that these palaces were scattered all around the island of Crete, not just the palace of Knossos. So here's just a map to show you all the different locations. So it really was the whole island was a similar culture, and it was this palatial culture. But we'll focus on the one that we know the most about, which is this palace at Knossos. So as you can see from this image I'm showing here, it's quite impressive, this palace. And this is thousands of years later. It's looking really good, this palace. So it must have been amazing back in the day when it was new. The colors are still so vibrant because of the way that they painted the walls. when they were first building it. So they, while the plaster was still wet, they would put the paint on the walls, and so that it would actually basically become a part of the wall. So that's kind of cool. So the colors are still very bright. Um, and the whole palace is very colorful, much of it decorated with these absolutely beautiful frescoes of different scenes, of dolphins and bull leaping, all sorts of different things that were relevant for the Minoans. And these palaces had areas inside of them pertaining to really all functions, all major functions of the society. So there was a central courtyard in the middle of the palace where we believe religious rituals and community events took place, like some of this bull leaping, maybe some feasting, other community events, dances. So there was that big central courtyard for the community. To the side of this were very nice residential areas that we assume were the royal residence where the kings, queens, princes lived for most of the time. So lots of nice chambers in there for them. On the other side of the courtyard were areas related to economic activity. Things like workshops for the production of final goods, so for like making bread or textiles, massive storage areas for all sorts of different goods that were collected from the non-elite population, such as grains, grapes, oil. And it's actually in this area that we find these giant clay storage containers called pithoi, pictured here. And so that's kind of how we know that this was a big storage area, because these are very massive. They could hold huge amounts of different goods. So it seems like what we have here in Crete is not at all a market economy. It's what we call a redistributive economy. So there was a central authority, these elites, kings and queens, that had control over a vast share of society's extra resources. So anything that wasn't going directly to feed and house and clothe the local population was going into these coffers in the palaces for the elites to basically control. And presumably they did this in a at least somewhat equitable way. So they kept the goods, but then gave them to the people when there were times of need, or there was a famine, or whatever might be the case. So in a way, it was sort of like an insurance policy. But of course, this gave the elites a lot of economic control. So it was really sort of a command and control economy in some ways. So the elites stored these there, and then they used some of them to fund the production of other more value-added goods, like different metalwork, finer textiles, and that sort of thing. So that was kind of how we envisioned the Minoan economy worked. So the palaces were basically the center for economic activity. So not only were these palaces centers for economic activity, we also believe that they were centers for religious activity. And we think this because of all of the bull leaping frescoes that are painted all around the palace, but especially in this large open courtyard. And so we think that these were used for these bull leaping rituals or plays or whatever they might be in these actual courtyards. And so while this could have been purely for entertainment, scholars believe that there was some ritual religious aspect to this because the Minoans seem to have believed in sort of a religious power of the bull. It represents strength, virility, reproductive fertility, all these kinds of things. So we think the Minoans sort of worshipped bulls in some fashion. And so this must have really been quite the sight to see these, very strong and capable men leaping over these bulls, which would have taken a ton of skill and bravery. And then even if you were part of the crowd, this bull wasn't that far away from you. And, it's a wild animal, so it could run at any moment and topple you over. So it must have been really full of excitement and intrigue. And I think it would have just been an awesome thing to witness. So I really wish I could have been there. So yes, we think that they were also centers for these really cool religious activities as well. And as I mentioned earlier in the episode, the Minoans were also a major trading power in the Eastern Mediterranean during this period. And we know this because we see Minoan objects scattered throughout the ancient Eastern Mediterranean. And I actually have a few examples to illustrate this. So one interesting one comes from the Palace Archives of Mari, which was a city-state in Syria, in ancient Syria. And so this had a king named Zimri Lin. He was actually contemporaries with Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, so they frequently exchanged letters and gifts and that sort of thing. And so apparently in the palace of Zimri-Lin, there was this pair of shoes that he received from the Minoans. They were Minoan-style shoes, and I guess he didn't really like them, so he actually re-gifted these shoes to King Hammurabi, king of Babylon. These shoes traveled from Syria to Mesopotamia. I guess Hammurabi didn't like them either, so he sent them back to the king, Zimri-Lin, with a bit of an apology. And so we don't know what happened to the shoes after that, but it really feels like the sisterhood of the traveling shoes. They went from ancient Crete to Syria to Mesopotamia and back again. So they were all over the place, these shoes. And I don't know exactly why they didn't like them. Maybe they were ugly, maybe they didn't fit, but I don't know what they look like. We don't have a picture of them, but that's just kind of amusing to think of these shoes that just kept traveling all over the place. So that's one indicator that, Minoan goods kind of got everywhere. And then we also have kind of a cooler example, and this is those frescoes that I was talking about in an Egyptian palace. So, as we'll talk about in later episodes, this group called the Hyksos ruled Egypt for a while, the northern parts of Egypt for a while. And so at one of their palaces in the capital of Avaris, we see these beautiful frescoes picturing bull leaping in the Minoan style. And so this shows that there must have been some fairly close contact between the Hyksos and the Minoans. Either they were sending architects back and forth, or just trading motifs and styles, or something like that. There was a lot of intermixing going on there. And we also see this because on Crete itself, we find that there are people buried with Egyptian-style scarabs. And so, of course, the scarab does not exist on Crete. It's pretty much only in ancient Egypt. It's basically a dung beetle, but it was very sacred to the Egyptians, and they were buried with them, usually with hieroglyphs on the back that either had like a spell or the name of somebody or something like that. But this same motif was then copied in ancient Crete, and people were buried with these scarab-looking things. On the back, it wasn't written anything, it was just sort of a pretty picture. But this also goes to show just how strong the cultural exchange was at this period. And so I think what we're really witnessing here is glimpses into the first international world order. Several major powers in different areas of the ancient Mediterranean, all engaging in diplomatic relations, trade, cultural exchange, political treaties, all these sorts of things. So it's sort of like an ancient G7, these powers that are all talking to each other and trying to discuss policy issues and establish standards and just really keep relations positive amongst them all so that they can cooperate. So I think that's really interesting. Back in 1500 BC, we're already seeing a pretty internationalized world, at least in the Eastern Mediterranean, what they considered to be the whole world. And I'll go into this a lot more in a future episode because it's a really interesting period of history. It's often called the Amarna period, this cultural exchange between all these major powers. And we'll talk about a lot of the separate powers as well. So for now, just keep in mind that Minoans were a major trading power, and they exchanged with a lot of other cultures at the time. So one last interesting thought I want to leave you with about the Minoans before we move over to the Mycenaeans is these palaces. So let's just look at a floor plan. So when you look at this, it is difficult to describe these in any way but labyrinthine. I mean, there's all sorts of little rooms, one after the other, connected by narrow hallways, small doors, almost like a maze. So it doesn't seem like much of a leap to think that mainland Greeks coming over and seeing these palaces for the first time, these beautiful, grand palaces, and then being awed by the grandeur, and then confused and unnerved by the winding maze-like hallways. And so they were so surprised and had such an impression of this that they immortalized it in the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. And for those of you who don't know the myth, I encourage you to go read it. It's very interesting. But, long story short, the mainland Greeks every 7 years, I think, have to give up some of their young lads and maidens to be ritually eaten by the Minotaur on Crete, because otherwise the Cretans threaten to invade the mainland. So it's this constant giving of, you know, young people to the Minotaur to feed off of, and this Minotaur lives below a palace on Crete in a maze-like labyrinth. And so it's highly likely that this is sort of a mythical retelling of some sort of conflict between the mainland Greeks and the Minoans that has, you know, kind of mythical aspects added, like the Minotaur. But presumably it's based on these palaces at Knossos, which I just think is really cool that we can link some real historical facts with ancient Greek myths. All right, so now that we've introduced the Minoans and talked about them at length, let's get in our little boat and hop over to mainland Greece, where the other great Bronze Age European civilization culture sprung up not too long after the Minoans, in around the year 1550. So this is the Mycenaean Greeks, the subject of many future epics and poems and mythology by later Greek authors. This is the world of Homer and Hesiod, described in the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Theogony. And this is what the Greeks often consider to be their golden age, an age of heroes when, you know, things were great in Greece and everyone was a hero. And this Mycenaean world encompassed a fairly large part of the Greek mainland, what would eventually become classical Greece. So much of what remains of the Mycenaean civilization is in the form of ruins of these quite massive citadels. So palaces with gigantic walls ringing around them and surrounded by, you know, presumably at the time, little villages. And then we also find the graves, the shaft graves of prominent individuals buried with a lot of luxurious grave goods. So this has led scholars to determine that Mycenaean towns were probably ruled by a warrior aristocracy, similar to Agamemnon and Odysseus from the Iliad, all of those heroes from ancient Greek myths. We actually do think that this was kind of a period when men like that, these war heroes, were ruling city-states in Greece, and that was the Mycenaean civilization. So we have these two great Greek Bronze Age cultures, hopefully living together peacefully, right? Well, probably not. In around the year 1450 BC, we actually see pretty significant destruction of the palaces on Minoan Crete that we talked about earlier. And most of those would never be rebuilt again. Some were rebuilt, notably the palace at Knossos. But what we find after this rebuilding is very interesting. So no longer do we see tablets written in Linear A, which was the written language of the Minoans. Rather, we find tablets written in what's called Linear B, which was the language of the Mycenaeans. So this has led scholars to conclude that the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece likely launched a massive invasion of Crete from the mainland, destroying the Minoan leaders, destroying a lot of their palaces, and completely taking over the island of Crete, rebuilding some of the palaces to then serve as their own. So many scholars actually think that this could be the historical seed of that legend we were talking about, the legend of Theseus, where the mainland Greeks are coming over to kill the Minotaur, but in real life it wasn't the Minotaur they were killing, but they were getting rid of the Minoans. So kind of sad, kind of interesting, kind of cool that we can link all of this mythology and history together. But this pretty much spelled the end of Minoan Crete, you know, because they were presumably kind of destroyed by the Mycenaeans and fled up to the hills on Crete. But Mycenaean culture continued to flourish for another few hundred years and continued to live this gold age of Bronze Age Greece. But sadly, neither would survive what's called the Bronze Age collapse, which was a full-on systems collapse throughout most of the Mediterranean era, or the Mediterranean area. But we're going to talk about that in a later episode. So that's all we'll say about early ancient Greece. For our next episode, we'll head back to Mesopotamia to talk about one of the most well-known figures in Near Eastern history, Hammurabi of Babylon.